Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Wednesday video. Today, we are uniquely blessed because many of you will have seen about a year or so ago, I worked with USNI to get pretty much the only decent reference work on Russian and Soviet battleships re-released because scalpers were charging extortionate amounts for it. So who better to talk about Russian and Soviet battleships than the man who actually wrote Russian and Soviet battleships? So everyone, please welcome Steve Mclaughlin. If you'd want to just let people know who you are and what you do beyond writing about Russian and Soviet battleships.
Well, these days I don't do too much beyond writing about Russian and Soviet ships, but I was a librarian for 35 years in San Francisco, and that gave me a lot of opportunities to do research. And and ever since I was a teenager, I was interested in battleships, and especially the battleships that were never built. And that kind of led naturally into all those Russian and Soviet battleships that were never built. So that sort of became my life's work at some point when I'm not quite sure how that happened.
Fair enough. And so, well, as is normal with these kinds of interview videos, we have a series of questions. So I guess the first one would be, part of the reason that we don't have many books on Russian and Soviet battleships is this small thing called Cold War. So how difficult is or was, or maybe is it again, to get accurate information on Russian ships, whether they be ones they actually built or hypotheticals, given that the Cold War kept most Western researchers out of the archives for so long?
It was very difficult, not just for Western researchers, but for Russian researchers as well. You in the earlier ships, for the Tsarist era, you could at least get decent technical information. But for the Soviet era, it was always a guessing game. Nobody really knew how big, how fast, how much armor. And of course, since none of the Soviet battleships were ever completed, we didn't even know what they looked like. And so it was all just this very vague. There were some Russian announcements. There were a few hints and mentions in Russian literature, but there wasn't really anything substantial until Glasnost came along and opened up the archives, which unfortunately are now starting to close down again, but that's a whole nother matter. And you really started to see some really excellent research being published in the late 80s and into the 90s on Soviet and even Russian battleships. And it was really kind of a revelation. And that's when I really got excited because I'd kind of been interested. But then it was like, okay, I've got to go out and learn Russian. I need to read this stuff. And so, there was just a flood of information. It was almost overwhelming in a lot of ways. And I did actually have a chance to research in the Russian archives in 2002, thanks to my friend Sergei Vinogradov. But even then, it was very difficult to get access. And the archives are not really arranged. It's not like the National Archives at Kew, where you ask for something and you get it 20 minutes later. It's like you ask for something in the Russian archives, and in those days, at least, you got it 3 or 4 days later. So it was a very cumbersome process. So these guys who have been working with the Russian archives, the Russian researchers, have done a tremendous job in wading through all of that stuff to get the information published.
Fair enough. So now we know a little bit about how difficult it was to actually get the stuff out of the archives in the first place. I'm having visions of, someone in charge of the archive just sending out an expeditionary party. It's like, well, expeditionary party number 3 didn't come back yesterday, so number 4 maybe we'll find the thing we're looking for today. Random Soviet super weapons wandering the corridors.
I don't know what it was. I really would have liked to have seen the actual archive, the shelving and so forth. I didn't have a chance to see that, but it was probably a very typical Russian process of, very bureaucratic. You have to submit this and you have to wait for that. So,
yeah. So getting onto the Russian Navy itself, obviously, learning about the ships, you pick up a fair bit on why they were building them in those ways. So what challenges did Russia face in terms of geography when it's trying to build these battleships? Because obviously the Royal Navy, you got England, the UK, the US Navy, you've got the Atlantic and the Pacific, but the Russians they've got the Baltic Sea, they've got the Black Sea. Later on, they're interested in the Pacific, and all the conditions in those different areas are, the weather, the shallowness of the water, etc. It's all very, very different. So, what are they facing with this geographical issue?
Well, there were huge problems. I mean, the first and most obvious is that they could never concentrate their forces. You had to have a fleet in the Baltic and a fleet in the Black Sea, and later on a fleet in the Pacific and a fleet in the Arctic Ocean. And the Black Sea was cut off up until the First World War, or after the First World War, it was cut off from access to and the world oceans. So the Black Sea Fleet was the Black Sea Fleet, and that was all it could do. The Baltic is shallow. It's rock strewn. The Russians lost a small battleship in 1897 when it ran onto a rock. The Sovietsky Soyuz class was designed to have a draft no more than 10.4 meters, which meant it had to have a bad hull form because they had to make it shallow and very broad. There was some limited inter-theater mobility thanks to the inland waterways, but those could never handle a battleship. So if you needed the battle fleet, say at Tsushima, you had to send it from the Baltic. And because of the treaty restrictions regarding the Turkish Straits, the Black Sea Fleet couldn't participate, which was a really sore point with a lot of Russian naval men. They just wanted to send their Black Sea Fleet through the Straits to join up with the fleet that was heading to the Pacific. So it was huge problems.
And I suppose coupled to that is, what are the industrial challenges that Russia faces as it's moving out of the sort of the turreted ironclad era and into the pre-dreadnoughts and dreadnoughts, which you cover in your book?
There were huge problems there as well. Russia was never an industrial country in the 19th century. It relied heavily on foreign expertise. It relied on a lot of Scots came over, founded machinery works, shipyards, but there were no skilled workers. They had huge problems retaining any kind of a workforce. It was a peasant economy. These guys would come and work in the off season at the shipyards, and then they'd go home, or they'd come to work in the city. But if the shipyard work slowed down, they'd all go home. So you see these constant issues in the naval ministry saying, we've got to build something, even if we don't, have a design for it. We got to build something just to keep these skilled workers in the shipyards. And a lot of these problems persisted into the Soviet era. The lack of skilled workers has, it's always been a problem in Russia. Nobody says, oh, good, let's go buy a Russian product. You might want something from Korea or Japan or China, but you don't want something made in Russia. And there's reasons for that. And so they had these huge problems industrially getting into the modern steel and steam world. And it showed in a lot of, especially in the earlier battleship designs.
Yeah, and I mean that kind of continues, doesn't it? With I believe, is it Sovietsky Ukraina that ends up needing to be just totaled because they find all the rivets are dodgy?
Yeah, it was oh gosh, I can't remember the name. Sovietskaya Belyorussa, I think.
Okay, fair
Um,
enough.
but yeah, no, yeah, I mean, yeah, they found out that they used 70,000 poor quality rivets, and they just said, okay, we'll give it up as a bad job. So it was, these problems persisted, and you could create, and Stalin tried to create a vast industrial base, in a decade, and you could sort of do that, although it was a tremendously harmful process to millions and millions of people who died. But you can't create a skilled workforce overnight, and you can't create experienced designers overnight. So that first generation of Soviet warships that you saw coming out in the 30s, all of them suffered from problems, from the submarines up to the attempts to build battleships.
And you mentioned earlier that when especially in the pre-dreadnought era, they're relying quite a lot on foreign expertise and so forth. How much influence do British or French ship design have in that kind of that early period leading up to World War One on Russian ship design?
There was a lot of influence. Early on, I mean, there was a big British basis behind the Russian Navy in a lot of ways. The Russians built a whole class in the 18th century of ships of the line based on HMS Victory. So there was always this continual British presence, even though there was oftentimes a lot of hostility between the two nations. The what Several Russian naval constructors were actually trained at Greenwich and in other British schools. So they had that British influence and they understood British practices, and they emulated a lot of those practices. And so when you look at some of the early Russian in the steel era ships, the armored cruiser Admiral Nakhimov, which was pretty much a direct copy of the British Warspite and Imperieuse, the British battleship, or the Russian battleship Nevadin, was basically a reduced scale version of HMS Nile and Trafalgar. So there was a lot of British influence. But starting in the 1880s, you began to see more French influence, first in cruisers and then finally in battleships. They had a battleship that Tsesarevich was built in France in the late 1890s, and that became the model for the Borodino class, which was the core of the Russian battle fleet at Tsushima. You know,
Hmm.
3 of them were sunk and 1 of them was captured. But that they were the most powerful ships in the Russian fleet at that time, and they were basically built to a French high freeboard, tumble home sides design.
So speaking of Tsushima, how did this kind of slightly weird mix of some Russian, some British, and some French designed ships actually deal with the challenges that confronted them in the Russo-Japanese War?
Well, the short answer would be badly. But a lot of that was leadership problems, not necessarily ship design problems. There were big differences between the fleet that was in the Far East, which was actually fairly well trained, although undermanned, and did perform, if not well, at least sort of adequately for a while. But the her when you get that fleet was lost when Port Arthur surrendered. And then you have this big battle fleet that's being sent out from the Baltic that's kind of a hodgepodge of ships, different types, different eras almost in their design, which meant that there was a lot of heterogeneous characteristics. Speed. At Tsushima, this fleet speed was limited to about 12 knots maximum because of some of the ships that had been attached to it. And Admiral Rozhdestvensky, who was the commander, had really fought against having those ships added to his fleet. He had envisioned having a small, fast fleet that could get to Vladivostok, could just sort of get there fast. And instead, he was saddled with these old, slow ships, some of which were actually called self-sinkers by the Russians.
Hmm.
These coast defense ships, for example, some ships built in the 1880s. It was just a hodgepodge on the theory that, there was one Russian naval theorist who offered the theory that having all these old, slow ships would draw some of the fire away from the modern, faster ships. And what kind of tactician would do that? It was just a nutty idea because, of course, what the Japanese did was they concentrated on the most powerful ships, and once they knocked those out of action, the rest was just fair pickings. You could just
Yeah.
pick them off one by one. So the fact that they didn't have a cohesive fleet and that the fleet was not really very well trained ultimately um, was the huge handicap at Tsushima. The ships individually weren't that bad. I mean, there's a lot of criticism of Tumblehome, which I think is to some degree exaggerated, things like that. But the ships took a tremendous amount of punishment before sinking. They weren't badly designed or built for the most part, but they were just this collection of ships that just didn't work well together tactically.
Fair enough. So I suppose at that point, the Russians have now lost. They've lost the Pacific Squadron. They've now lost the second Pacific Squadron, which is most of their Baltic fleet. I think they're left with one Borodino, isn't it? Slava, which didn't wasn't quite ready in time.
Yeah,
Uh,
right.
and so what lessons does the Russian fleet take away from the Russo-Japanese War, other than the obvious "don't send everything in the kitchen sink"?
Well, the biggest lesson had to do with the impact of high explosive shells. They had the Japanese shells, even the armor piercing shells, were very sensitive. And so they didn't penetrate armor. They basically exploded always on impact. And because they were using a very powerful explosive, the Shimose stuff, the the effects were devastating. They wrecked the upper works, started fires. Anything that was even vaguely flammable was set on fire by these things. And so that experience was sort of became deeply ingrained in the Russian naval psyche. And so when they designed their first generation of battleships, the first generation of dreadnoughts after the war, they took that into account. And that's why you see those ships with very minimal superstructures and with completely armored hull sides. Even if the armor wasn't thick, the idea was that it would defeat high explosive shells. And so, it would the idea was we will fight at a long range because Tsushima had actually been a fairly close range battle. And so tactically they said, well, we'll fight at a longer range. And so armor penetration by AP shells won't be as big a factor as high explosive shells that'll wreck the enemy's fire control, his upper works. And that's how we'll win is by having these ships that are basically proof against high explosive shells.
Fair enough. So you mentioned the this minimalized superstructure, but as we know, the Gangut's and their contemporaries in the sort of the derivatives that were built for the Black Sea Fleet, they have a very, very different design style to almost everybody else. You've covered a couple of bits, but they also have this kind of all at a level continuous run of gun turrets instead of clustering them fore and aft super firing, etc. So what else motivates this very sort of very altered design style of battleship compared to everyone else in the dreadnought period?
Well, that's one of the interesting things. I think most interesting. I mean, it's obviously visually the most obvious feature of those ships, um, and you have to sort of dig down to find out what was going on. But at that time, you mentioned super firing turrets, but when you look at British turrets and in some other countries, they weren't super firing; they were superimposed because they couldn't fire over one another because the sighting hoods were on top of the turret, the lower turrets as well. So in the British ships, they could only usually fire their full broadsides or their upper turrets over the lower turrets when they were trained about 30 degrees off the center line. So the Russians were looking at this and were aware of this problem, and they said, okay, if we spread the turrets out evenly, then we have better fields of fire because all of our guns can fire fairly close fore and aft. They can't fire, the middle turrets can't
Mm.
fire on the ends of the ship, but they could fire fairly close to the center line if they were trained at their extreme angles. So it was very logical for the time. And it was only later when superimposed turrets truly became super firing turrets and could fire over directly one another that you see the disadvantage of the Russian scheme. They considered it had some other advantages. The weights were more evenly distributed along the hull, which meant that they could, save a little structural weight. There were fewer bits and pieces above the deck to be destroyed by higher explosive shell fire. So they saw it as an advantage, and they persisted with it. Right up through the ships they were building at the time of the First World War that were never completed, the Ismail class battle cruisers. So they were satisfied with it. They thought it met the job at hand.
And I suppose, especially for the Baltic fleet, if you've got all your turrets on the main deck level and minimal superstructure, that's also going to reduce your stability issues when it comes to ice.
Yeah, well, it did increase stability. You didn't have higher weights higher
Yeah.
up. Um, I, since they used it in the Black Sea, I don't think there was so much of an ice concern, although the Black Sea does get ice in coastal waters. But I think they saw it as we've got this figured out. The Russo-Japanese War taught us a lot that other countries don't know,
Mhm.
and so this scheme seems to fit what we need.
Fair enough. And I suppose, and then that obviously leads into the First World War. So they've got the Ganguts in the Baltic. They've got their derivatives completing in the Black Sea, and they've got a small collection of pre-dreadnoughts, basically what's left to them after the Russo-Japanese War. Um, and they have to deal with the Ottomans and the Germans. So, how does the Russian battleship fleet perform in those theaters against the Central Power fleets?
Well, to start with, they performed much better than they did in the Russo-Japanese War. The battleships in the Baltic didn't see a lot of action. The pre-dreadnoughts did. The Tsesarevich and the Slava were very active in the Gulf of Riga, which was kind of a critical theater for part of the war. And they did a pretty good job against what was basically the German second team, because of course the dreadnoughts were all off, in the North Sea countering the British or trying to. So those ships performed well, but the Gangut class never really had a chance to show its abilities. Um, and of course, sitting in the harbor at what's now Helsinki, now it was then Helsingfors, they sort of became breeding grounds for the revolutionary movement and were among the leading ships when the mutinies broke out in 1917. In the Black Sea, the dreadnoughts were more active. They had more scope against the Turks. The big problem in the Black Sea was you had the Goeben, the German battle cruiser that wound up in Constantinople when the war broke out, and she was faster than anything the Russians had. So when the war began, they formed a squadron of all their pre-dreadnoughts and kept them together. They were not allowed to travel separately, basically. And this worked because the Goeben did have one action with the Russian pre-dreadnoughts early in the war. And she was basically driven off by them. She got a shell hit that almost set off a magazine explosion in the 150 millimeter magazines. And she withdrew, despite German claims to the contrary. She did, you can see it on the maps, and the German official history is kind of like sketchy on, we then lost sight of the Russians in the fog. But you turned around and went the other way. So you're not going to find the Russians. But anyway, the pre-dreadnoughts did a good job for what they did, as long as they stuck together. The dreadnoughts had a couple of encounters with Goeben, and one in particular with the Imperatrica Yekaterina Velikaya, in which the Goeben was chased off by the Russian battleship. Unfortunately, of course, the Russian ship was slower than the battle cruiser was, and so she got away. But there's one German report where the commander of the Goeben, said the new Russian battleship can steam and can shoot, because the Russian gunnery was actually very good, and so the Germans respected the Russian Black Sea Fleet and didn't take too many chances.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of an. I always find the Black Sea always tends to be the overlooked theater when it comes to both world wars. And people kind of think nothing happened there, but in actual fact, there's a fair bit running around in both World War One and World War Two. Just fewer
Yeah,
battleships in World War Two.
yeah. It's a fascinating theater, and the contrast with the Baltic is fascinating, because in the Baltic you had the Russians on the defense, and in the Black Sea you had them on the offense. So there was a whole different mindset, underpinning their actions, and and thanks to the Black Sea Fleet, they were able to carry out, for example, some very impressive amphibious operations along the coast of northern Anatolia. Um, so it was, they knew they had an advantage and they were going to use it. Um, they just never quite had all the means they needed to really push an offensive home against the Turkish and German forces.
Okay. So then, obviously, as you mentioned, the not helped by a good portion of the Baltic fleet, you have the Soviet Revolution, and everything becomes the Red Fleet. What are the plans that for the battle fleet that then develop in the interwar period under the Soviet Union, under Lenin, and then under Stalin? Or do they have any plans at that point?
Well, in the 1920s, the Soviet Union was, pretty much had been devastated by the First World War, followed by, like 3 or 4 years of civil war and revolution. So there were no real plans for the Navy in the 1920s. In fact, Lenin almost disbanded the Navy completely because in 1921 there was a revolt in Kronstadt, the island fortress near St. Petersburg, or Leningrad. Well, it was then Petrograd, and then it became later Leningrad. What in that case, the issue was that the guys on Kronstadt, they weren't counter-revolutionaries. They just felt that the Bolshevik regime was oppressive and was hindering, was behaving just as badly as the Tsarist regime. So they rebelled. They were basically shelled and then stormed by the Red Army, and there are varying numbers about how many were killed. But in the wake of that, Lenin basically said, these guys are a problem. This Navy is just not something we need. And it was Trotsky who came back and said, no, we need a Navy. We need a Navy. Even if it's not a very powerful one, we've got to keep the Navy going. So what they did after that was, they introduced a whole bunch of communist indoctrination into the Navy to, sort of get them into line. But as a result of that and the Civil War and everything else, there just wasn't the industrial base, the economic base to build a battle fleet. They basically were content to rehabilitate either existing or Tsarist era ships that had been under construction and not completed during the First World War. When you get to the 1930s, you begin to see a revival of naval shipbuilding, on a larger scale. First submarines, then they built these big destroyer leaders, the Leningrad class, and they were working their way up. And then with Italian assistance, they designed the Kirov class cruisers. And in 1931, when all of this was just getting started, Stalin was already saying, in 5 years, I don't rule out the possibility that we'll be building battleships. And what was funny about that was at that time, the official policy was to persecute the guys who endorsed, were pushing for battleships, who were the old Tsarist era officers who had come into the Red Navy. So you had Stalin saying one thing, but in practice, he was doing something else to suppress those people. But Stalin wanted a big fleet. Ultimately, that was his ultimate game. And Stalin was always a very clever tactician, in that he could maneuver his among his political groupings to keep not only power but to get what he wanted done. And so he wanted a big navy from the get-go, as far as I can tell. And when he had eliminated all the opposition, when he had all the people he wanted in the right places, he said, okay, now we're going to build battleships. And that decision came about 1935, roughly, or that the announcement of that decision came around that time. And so that's when they began seriously to look at how are we going to build battleships.
And that's where the Sovietsky Soyuz class comes in,
Right.
and various other designs which they're considering.
Yes, a wide variety of designs.
I must admit, actually, I find that section of your book one of the most amusing, because watching the sort of the ping pong game that's going back and forth between is like, we're going to have this, but no, actually we want this, but if we want this, we have to take this off, but take this off, then we lose that. So, but we add this back on, and in the end, they actually wind up with something that's actually vaguely similar to what they started with, just with a lot of unnecessary waving of hands in the interim.
Well, that's one of the things that's fascinating about the Soviet shipbuilding process is, it was jerked around a lot. In the Royal Navy, the U.S. Navy, the Japanese Navy, even the German Navy, you sort of can see a line in the development of a ship. We're going to go this way. We're going to, we want to wind up somewhere around that. Um, in the Soviet Navy in the 1930s, especially, it's like, where are we going? What are we doing? I don't know from one day to another, what kind of a ship I'm supposed to be designing. Is it supposed to be, fast? Is it supposed to have 14-inch guns, 16-inch guns? I don't know. And so they went through all these variations, all these different sizes of ships. It was kind of jerked around by the treaty process because as the process was getting underway, they signed the Anglo-Soviet Naval Agreement, which brought the Soviet Union into the whole Washington Treaty, London Treaty scheme of things. And so suddenly, we were planning to build 50,000-ton battleships. Now we've got to design 35,000-ton battleships. But then they sort of started work on that, and they said, well, 35,000 tons isn't enough for what we want. But if we make it 40-odd thousand tons, maybe it won't be too obvious that we're violating the treaty. But at some point it was like, never mind. We're going to build 60,000-ton battleships, and that's when they finally reached sort of a point where the Sovietsky-Soyuz design could evolve.
I sometimes like to joke that when you get to some of the later German designs like H-42 and H-44, a lot of those designs are basically some poor ship designer going, "I'll draw whatever you want, just don't send me to the Eastern Front." And I sometimes wonder whether some of those Russian designers were sort of similar. They're like, "I'll draw whatever Comrade Stalin says today, just don't send me to Gulag or don't send me to fight fight the Germans."
I think there was an element of, we will do what you say. We're not gonna try and advise you beyond a certain point. There was sometimes pushback on specific technical issues, but what Stalin wanted was what Stalin wanted, and he was very directly involved in the design process. He was not a hands-off guy. Every major feature of the ship design process ran through the Council of the Council of Ministers Defense Committee, which was headed unofficially by Stalin. Stalin liked to have a figurehead in charge of things where he could be not behind the scenes, but off to the side of the scenes, pulling the strings. So he was directly involved, and when he made a decision, that was essentially law. The problem was he could change his mind. The best example of that is the post-war Stalingrad class, where he sent the designers off to design a battle cruiser, and he said they came back with a 40,000-ton design, and everything was approved and everything was moving forward. And then in a meeting a few months later, he says, "I want it to be smaller and I want it to be faster." So here are these guys who have been working on for a couple of years now to design the ship, and suddenly, it's got to be smaller and faster. How the heck are we going to do that? So Stalin could be a wild card in the whole process.
Yeah, it's and not exactly the best boss to work for.
No.
No. So obviously, as we know, the Sovietsky-Soyuz weren't completed. The Russian Navy enters World War II with this, as you said, this kind of holdover fleet from the Tsarist era and a few new ships. How do the Russian battleships perform in World War II, if they do anything?
In World War II, they were basically mobile floating batteries. You had two battleships, the two dreadnoughts in Leningrad, and you had the one in the Black Sea. The Black Sea ship did some shore bombardment work early in the war, but before long, her guns were shot out and couldn't be replaced. And there was also mounting concern over German air power and what it could possibly do to a ship in the open sea. So she basically stayed on the Caucasian coast for the rest of the war until Sevastopol, her named city, was recaptured, and she sailed in there in all her tarnished glory. The two battleships in the Baltic Sea, in Leningrad at the time, never left the immediate area of Leningrad, but they did valuable work in shore bombardment, and that includes the battleship Marat, which was hit by Stukas relatively early in the war and sank in shallow waters. Her forward magazine exploded, so the whole bow of the ship was basically demolished. But they were able to refloat it, sort of put a big concrete bulkhead at the front of the blown off section, and put her three after turrets back in action, which I suppose was one of the advantages of having that linear arrangement of turrets, was that one turret could explode without destroying more than itself. So they raised her and used her as a floating battery throughout the war during the siege of Leningrad, and they did very valuable work. The two battleships did, but they were not serving as battleships. I mean, if they'd been shore batteries, they could have been just as effective. But that's what they did. That's what was needed in that moment, and they did it, and they did a good job of it.
And then, of course, with the end of World War II, as you cover, the Russians don't quite give up the idea of capital ships, whether they be battleships or battle cruisers, the Kronstadt and Stalingrads, etc. But nothing really ever comes of that. Did any of them actually come close to actually being built, or were they just kind of Stalin's dead, let's chuck it all in the bin and forget this ever happened?
Well, that was pretty much the case. They were after the war. There was a transitional period that we tend to forget about. Oh, World War II proved the battleship was a dead issue, but there was a transitional period where battleships were still seen as potentially important vessels for a while. They had good anti-aircraft. They offered great flagship capabilities. They had a lot of space. So it wasn't completely irrational to consider building battleships in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And in fact, the Royal Navy did too for a very short time. But by the time you get to the latter part of the 40s, the U.S. battleships are all being mothballed one after another, except for the Iowas, which were kept on as a while more as flagships than anything else in some ways. But it's starting to get obvious that we're not going to build battleships. They did do some battleship design work. It was continuing up until Stalin's death, but it was never programmed for construction. Stalin himself had even pushed off building battleships. He was more interested in battle cruisers, the Stalingrad class. And those were the only ones that came close. In fact, one of those, the name ship Stalingrad, was basically almost ready for launching when Stalin died. And she was then basically just consigned to be a target for the new generation of missile weapons. She was towed off to a sandbank, basically, and just sort of sat there while they shot missiles at it. And that was the last gasp of Soviet capital ship construction, until, of course, you get to the much later battle cruisers of the 80s.
Yeah, the Kirovs again.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's a quick run through of the pre-dreadnought and dreadnought, super dreadnought era Russian design. So thank you very much for that. I mean, it is a small fraction of the total knowledge I'm sure you've accumulated for that period. Of course, if you want to learn more, then you can obviously go and buy a copy of Russian and Soviet battleships from USNI Press. There's a discount code as well. If you use my name, Drach, D-R-A-C-H, you can get a nice discount off of it. And obviously you also get a discount if you're a member. So go and get some copies. It's certainly worth reading. And of course, I suppose the other question to ask is, I believe that you're gradually working your way through Russian and Soviet cruisers.
Yes, and gradual is the word. It's been a tough process. I won't go into the gory details, but it's proven much more difficult than the battleship book was. And of course, there's a lot more cruisers than there were battleships. Yeah. But I'm hoping to finish the manuscript by the end of this year. Fingers crossed. When it'll see the light of day, I don't dare make a prediction.
Well, when it does, we'll be certain to let everybody know because I'm looking forward to that whenever it does show up. I'm particularly looking forward to what kind of nightmare issues the 1930s era Kirovs had.
Yeah, that's a fun topic, or maybe that's the wrong word for it, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So yeah, thanks very much. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. Of course, as I said, you pick up a copy of Russian Soviet Battleships if you can, and keep an eye out for new ships, new books about Russian ships. And there is also a couple of, I believe you've done a couple of articles for the Warship Journal.
Yes, most recently a series. Well, it's going to be about three articles total on the Sovietsky Soyuz design, and then the follow-up designs that were being worked on up until the German invasion, which I don't think have even been really well covered in the Russian literature. So those are kind of unique, and
Hmm.
I think that was the 2021 and 2022 issues of Warship. And in 2023, I'm going to have an article on the Italian UP-41 design, which was sold to the Soviets.
Well, that'll be interesting because there's not a huge amount of information out there in one place on UP-41.
No,
uh,
there isn't, and it's kind of frustrating.
yeah.
I was lucky enough. My friend Sergei Vinogradov sent me a Soviet report on the design, and that forms the basis for a lot of that article.
Yeah. More recently, I've been involved in a number of discussions over sort of does UP-41 represent Italian ideas on how to succeed the Littorio class, or is it an independent design element and everything? Because of course, it doesn't have the spaced armor or the Pugliese torpedo defense systems that the Littorios do. But I'll be looking forward. I've got my copy of Warship 2023 pre-ordered, so I'll be looking forward to reading that. No spoilers. So yeah, I'll links down below everyone to the various warship journals that you can still get, I think, because they're fairly recent, so they're still in print, and everything else we've talked about. Once again, thank you very much to Steve Mclaughlin for taking the time out to share his expertise with us. And we'll see
Been
you
my
all.
pleasure.
Thank you very much. I will see you all in another video. Bye, everyone.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.